Hi, I'm Catherine Jean Lopez from National Review and the National Review Institute. Jedd Medefind, thank you so much for joining me from the Christian Alliance for Orphans. If people aren't familiar with you, besides being at CAFO, you ran the faith-based office in the White House under George W. Bush, and have been doing lots of good work over the last few decades, including being a father and a husband, which is always the most important work. So,
Yes.
Jedd, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Catherine.
Well, I wanted to first of all talk. There are so many things I want to talk to you about, and that's always the case when when I have the opportunity to talk with you, because you're involved in so much good and have so many useful and wise observations, I find. But in particular, the news moment here is Christian Alliance for Orphans has a new report out about some adoption trends out there. And we'll talk about a bit about this, but when I saw it probably as both a report on what's going on and hopefully an encouragement too to people who are particularly Christians who are involved in foster care and adoption, because it can be not only very challenging, it is challenging, period, but it can be
Hmm.
very trying and frustrating as well, especially if you're on the foster care side of it. Foster parents don't get a lot of encouragement, so I think you were partially wanting to encourage them. But before we get to the encouragement, I mean, I open the report and I see 3.1% of Americans have adopted, and less than that, I think it's 2.6 have fostered. So immediately I'm just shaking my head. What are we doing? We're failing these poor children. And obviously that is true, but there's so much more to the story, right? And that's where I you had a wonderful article on the Christian Broadcasting Network's website where were talking about how having faith-based families in the mix in foster care and adoption actually makes for flourishing families. And so there's a positive takeaway from this report too. Can you talk a little bit about it, Jedd?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, so we did the report in partnership with a firm that does a lot of research, Pinkston. They were great partners, and we polled more than 1,500 Americans on their perspectives and experiences with foster care and adoption, their views of the system, their sense of what barriers they might face or have faced in getting involved, and in part with a view for how can we invite more people into this. What one of the interesting statistics we learned is that 78% of Americans haven't even seriously considered foster care and adoption. So on one hand, that feels disappointing. On the other, it's a great opportunity, right? That
Yeah.
there's 3 out of 4 Americans haven't really thought about this, and so while certainly foster care and adoption aren't a something that all people would or could or should do, it's something that a lot of people can consider for the first time. And some of those folks may say, "Wow, this." Even though this would be very difficult, there's also so much beauty in it. And as I learn more, I want to be involved, whether through fostering or adopting or in other ways too. There's as we'll talk about, so many different ways to be involved in the lives of kids and families in the foster system. And so, we saw in that and much of the other data as well, a lot of hopefulness, reason for hope, and opportunities to help people understand the need better, the realities of the challenges, but also the great rewards of that all of us who've been a part of this and experienced it personally, have found as we've waded deeper into it.
Do you have a sense, Jedd, of why it is that so few people do look into it at all? And we know that once they look into it and even get certified for foster care, the majority drop out within a year. But why is it that so many don't even consider it when, as our friends Elizabeth Kirk and Ryan Hanlon have recently told us in a study they did, which we knew, people kind of think of adoption as American as apple pie, right? But then they don't get involved and don't know much about it. Why is that?
Yeah, we did ask people specifically about barriers to involvement and what they perceived was keeping them from it. And interestingly, the largest single barrier by a large margin that was listed was the financial concerns. And I think for some that involves the cost of actually adopting. And for I think probably for many others, it's just the added cost of, loving and caring and raising another child, right? And they're
Right.
thinking, do I have the financial capacity for that? I think, just quick side note here, Catherine, but the recent big beautiful bill passed by Congress included a really significant extension and expansion of the adoption tax credit and making it more accessible to middle class and working class families and things. So there's a direct help on that financial element in terms of the adoption process and costs right around it. Um, but I think it's not, what we also saw, and I think some of the data, as you dig into it deeper, you also recognize that a lot of people, I think the two other big barriers we saw was one was people just saying they don't have the time to be involved. And I think that is a deeper challenge and problem because I think it's fundamentally about what do we want our lives to be about? Like, if we are spending hours a day on screens, for instance, and don't have time for mentoring a child in foster care or welcoming a child through foster care, that just fundamentally speaks to what we consider most important. And these are deep issues.
Yeah.
Issues our faith addresses, issues of heart and character, and really what we want to look back on from the end of our lives, right? And so those are deep, important kind of philosophical and religious and faith life questions for people, for people to talk through without judgment, but just inviting people to consider maybe a different set of life priorities. So that'd be one. But the other thing that was very interesting is right up next to not enough time was people saying, I don't feel I have anything valuable to offer. And that happily, that is a huge mistake for
Mhm.
people. And we can share with people that, wow, for so many kids in the foster system, whether kids who need adoption or maybe they just are temporarily in the system, just a single, consistent, caring adult relationship really could make all the difference for them. And, whether we're talking about being a mentor to a youth who's aging out of care, being a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate for, a younger child who's in the system, getting involved in supporting biological families that have come apart and are struggling and walking with the parent, hoping that they can get their life back together and receive their kids back as well as more traditional forms of fostering and adopting. There are ways for anyone to be involved in terms of even if you're in high school, choosing to babysit or care for, help out a foster or adoptive family. If you're retired, being like a surrogate grandparent to one of these families can make a world of difference. Actually, when my wife and I adopted our little girl, we had at the time four relatively small children, and so there was a retired woman named Lorraine who said, I want to do all the grocery shopping for you guys indefinitely. And so we would just give her our grocery list, and every week she would do all the shopping, show up at our house with all the groceries. And it was such a huge help,
Right.
saving an hour or two every week, but also just we felt so loved. And we, Lorraine still feels like I just feel such affection for her. This was 15 years ago. And
That's
so
awesome.
anyway, really everyone, not everyone's called to adopt or foster, but everyone can play a role. And that's a wonderful truth.
And it probably seems like such a little thing when we're talking about Congress and tax credits and all these other issues, but probably the two of you weren't getting the kids together to go to the grocery store together. So I'm picturing your wife trying to get the little ones in a
Yes.
car and like all the pieces that go into having to get to the grocery store and being there. And it is actually a huge burden to take off of a family.
Yes.
And so yeah, it's so important and we don't talk about it enough. I kind of in a Catholic context try to talk about this so often in Catholic churches, and you've heard me say this before and you know this full well. because the Catholic Church is so institutionalized in many ways. We have big institutions in every diocese. There often is the sense that, okay, well, someone's taking care of the problems, right? So someone's taking care of foster care and adoption, and these aren't issues I have to worry about because I have all my things I need to worry about, right? So often in a parish you don't even know who the people who are fostering are, and so I there are ministries like Springs of Love, which I'm on the board of, which is trying to fix that problem, get to know the families and actively ask families to step up to the plate, not to say to make themselves known, not to say, hi, I need help, I want to be a charity case, because people don't want to do that,
Mhm.
but to say, yes, this is a beautiful thing, and we want to be part of the community with this, and the community should want that, and so we were talking offline about Naomi Riley in the book she has, No Way to Treat a Child, and it talks about a lot of the challenges in foster care and child welfare today. But it has this glorious chapter about so many mostly evangelical ministries that wrap around families, and there's one group where you can't even walk into a training without bringing a bunch of friends along who will do the training with you. So it's not like, yeah, people in your church, they said, yeah, we'll help you. No, they have committed to helping you by spending a day at training and all the rest. And that's how we change the culture. And there are mercifully some groups leading the way, and CAFO is in the lead there. And one of the reasons, and if you would, Jedd, talk a little bit about CAFO, because I know one of the reasons I find CAFO so invaluable is you were talking a few minutes ago about how people think that they have nothing to offer. And I think we do these poor children a disservice who are in foster care when we act like you have to be a saint. You have to be some kind of superhero
Yeah.
in order
Yeah.
to be a foster or an adoptive parent. When, as you said, children need an adult, like, obviously we want you to be a stable human being, right? And be able to provide on different levels, but we're not looking for some kind of exotic person here. There are plenty of Americans who can fit the bill, and what you see when you go to one of CAFO's annual meetings, which I have, is, yes, these are extraordinary people who are inspiring, but they're regular people.
Yes. Yes. Very much so. Yeah. And that really is the core vision. I mean, it's the idea of children that are wrapped by loving relationships, whether that's through foster care or adoption or committed mentor, other ways. But that family or adult is also wrapped by a community that's supporting them.
Hmm.
And that this theoretically could happen in different contexts, but really the local church is the place where it is going to happen most. You've got the motivation there, right? The calling from scripture, but also kind of the infrastructure of people gathering every week and ideally being involved in their lives, each other's lives. And so it can happen in such a wonderful way. And so, the CAFO has created a simple field guide, we call it, for churches that want to encourage and support and wrap around families. And it's called Everyone Can Do Something, because the idea is everyone can, right? And
Right.
it is the high school student, it's the retiree, it's the mechanic who can work on cars and help families with their cars. It's um, the orthodontist who's willing to do orthodontia for kids in these families, and it's the retired school teacher who can tutor. It's so really everyone can do something, and it happens ideally in the context of a community, right, where people are engaging this together, and so that is what CAFO seeks to encourage. That CAFO includes about 300 nonprofit organizations, so certainly there is a need for institutions and organizations with expertise. But the kind of the rubber hits the road in the relationships, right? The child that's wrapped by a family or caring adults, and then that's all in the context of a local church, ideally.
we have just talked about community and how people are able more capable than they realize to step up to the plate with resources. Now, that having been said, when you're dealing with foster care and adoption, you're dealing with trauma, even in the best of scenarios. There's separation anxiety, there's, even in the best case scenario, there's a breakage that happens, there's a trauma that happens. Why should people, being prudent, obviously you want people to be prudent, but why should people not be afraid of that?
Yeah, yeah. There'd be a few reasons I'd list, but I would actually start by saying, in some sense, people should be afraid. And what I mean is they need to know realistically that when these precious kids have experienced the world at its most broken. They have experienced things and pain that no human should face. And when we invite them into our lives, into our homes, into our hearts, we will share in some of that pain with them. We need to reckon with that. And if our purpose in life and our highest value is just comfort and convenience and control and smooth sailing, then we probably shouldn't get involved. Maybe you could still mail in a check, and there's still good one can do from that place, right? Helping out other families, keep your distance, but be helpful, and thank the Lord for people who need to do that. But I would also say, for those who would at least consider that, we do need a theology of suffering, meaning going through hard things does not prove that something is bad,
Right.
right? It actually, as much as none of us want to go through hard things, some of the best gifts in life come along that road, and especially when we are following the call of our faith. And the Apostle Paul talks about the idea of the fellowship of sharing in Christ's sufferings. That at the core of our faith is the reality of a Savior who died for us out of love. And there's a sense in which we participate in that when we go through really hard things in love for others, and in a particular way for kids that we've welcomed in. And so those are things actually I think it's important to talk honestly about.
Hmm.
Um, and then move on to the fact that, oh man, this can be wonderful too. There really are delights and joys that you just don't find anywhere else when you welcome in a child, and you're getting them ready for bed, or you're giving them a kiss at night, or you're telling them a story, and you're seeing a child that has really perhaps languished, beginning little by little, two steps forward, one steps back, but beginning to flourish in new ways because of the love that they're experiencing. That's about as good as it gets. And
Hmm.
so, I want that for people, alongside the reality that it's not going to be easy.
Now, continuing on that honest conversation, there's the issue of older children who obviously have suffered even more. And there is often a concern that, adults are not equipped for this, but also the concern, if you already have children, what's going to happen? What are you exposing those children to?
Mhm.
How do you have that conversation with people?
Yeah. Well, like what we were talking about before, that needs to be taken very seriously. And there are cases where it wouldn't be wise to do certain things. Like I would say, if, for instance, if there's a teenager who's been exposed to significant, sexual abuse, probably, bring them into a home with young children probably isn't the wisest thing. However, that teenager still needs love, right? And so even though maybe you don't bring them into your home, kind of in a living situation, that you can still mentor them and walk with them and help them know that despite the twisted ways they were treated when they were younger, that they are still valued and loved, And so it might look like that. It also, we know a number of couples that when they became empty nesters, they began to welcome in teenagers in foster care, right? And in some cases even adopted, which is just a crazy thought, right? You've just kind of, kicked off your shoes and I'm an
Right.
empty nester, I can travel and this and that, and then welcoming in a 15-year-old who's known a lot of hurt and signing up for all that comes with that. But again, it can be very challenging, very costly, but also quite beautiful. As I mean, virtually everyone who has known some of that. So many friends of mine would say, hardest thing I've ever done, best thing I've ever done too.
Well, and I think of someone like Sharon L. Fulton, who was the lead plaintiff in that Supreme Court case that Beckett won, where the
Yes.
city was cutting off, Philadelphia was cutting off Catholic charities from being involved in foster care and adoption because of religious beliefs, and was an absurd case, as you recall. But sidebar, there
Yeah.
wasn't even a couple that
Yeah.
was
And a
complaining that
wonderful
filed this.
unanimous decision by the Supreme Court,
Yes, thanks be to
affirming
God.
that our child welfare system needs a true, every willing partner at the table. And that
Exactly.
includes deeply committed faith-based organizations without having to sacrifice their deep religious commitments. Those same commitments that motivated them into service in the first place.
And I remember being super encouraged, just sidebar, which I'll stop in a second, super encouraged at the time by people who were involved in same-sex marriages, who were saying the Catholic Church needs to be at the table here. We need more rather than less, and
Yeah.
let couples go to the agency that best represents their values, right?
Yeah.
Um, this is how you function in a pluralistic democracy. Um, but Sharon L. Fulton, the lead plaintiff, was an example of somebody who, older Black woman, kept bringing these boys into her house, these older boys into her home, and probably, I mean, I remember the case was around the Black Lives Matter marches and all, and like this woman is living, breathing, making sure that we know that Black Lives Matter because she saved numerous Black boys' lives by doing exactly what you're saying, bringing them in and giving them her love and wisdom and safety and there are lots of unsung heroes out there who are making those kind of decisions who don't have to, like the empty nester couple you mentioned. They could be taking a well-deserved vacation, but they also could be offering a child not only their love but some older siblings as well.
Yes.
It's really
Yes.
a tremendous gift to give.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and Catherine, I'll add to that too. Speaking of Catholic Charities of Philadelphia there and many other faith-based organizations that are serving in the foster system across the country, one of the questions we asked was, what entities and institutions do you most trust to do the right thing for kids and families in foster care? And the level of trust for government in that was 24%. So less than a quarter of Americans said, I trust government to do the right thing for kids and families in foster care. For nonprofits generally, it rose to 33%. For faith-based organizations, it rose to 49%. So more than double the level of trust for government. And this is, of course, in an era when trust for all institutions and public schools and the media, everything is very low. And so to have that high
Including the
level of
churches.
trust, exactly, including churches, very high level of trust. And then even more notable to me was that for people who had been personally involved in the system, that rate went to 60%, saying that for faith-based organizations. So the more someone had actually had in-person experience with the system, the more likely they were to say, hey, these faith-based organizations, these are the ones we can especially trust to do the right thing for kids.
And you and I both have heard countless testimonies from people who have just these beautiful relationships with people in their agencies that really make it possible
Yeah. Yes.
to do the work of foster care and adoption. Um, One of the things that we haven't talked about is international adoption. How much of that is CAFO's focus?
Yeah. Early on, a lot of families and individuals came into this realm of ministry and service through intercountry adoption. Like they had, read in the newspaper about the AIDS crisis in Africa. And it was kind of an era in the 90s, I would say, when people were growing much more aware of the world's needs, the world's hurt. And so a lot of families said, hey, we hear about orphans in Romania or in Guatemala or in Ethiopia. We would be willing to welcome one or more into our family. And so intercountry adoption, rose dramatically in the 2000s. And and so a lot of families, including in the CAFO community, came through that door, and then they became aware of the broader needs. Wow, there's not only kids needing this around the world. There's kids right in my neighborhood, and so there's a lot of families I know who adopted internationally and then did foster care. That includes us, actually, my family, and at this point, as you know, Catherine, intercountry adoption has become tremendously constricted. And so you really have, it's not that there's not kids in need of families in other parts of the world, but you could say, and it's not that there's not families in the US who would be glad to receive them, but the bridge between them, the slender path between them that we've called intercountry adoption, is what has been constricted. And some of the, it's complicated. Some of the reasons for that are good. People are trying to ensure that there's no corruption in the process, things like that. But some of the reasons for that are really tragic. It's governments, for diplomatic and kind of tit for tat reasons, cutting off that for reasons of kind of national pride, acting like they don't have a problem with orphans in their country. And so
Right.
in essence, what happens is those kids can't find families abroad, so they grow up on the streets or in orphanages in the country. So, again, it's complicated, but the number of intercountry adoptions has shrunk dramatically. We still see some of that. We see a lot of wonderful organizations working to encourage domestic adoption in these other countries. So some of the countries that were countries that allowed, kids to be adopted to the US, now some of those countries have growing local adoption efforts in countries where that culturally was not really considered or acceptable in the past, but a lot of them saw kids being adopted to American families, kids who were considered as in the words of actually one Ethiopian friend, he said, we consider these kids trash, but Americans were welcoming them into their families. And we realized these families were seeing these kids as treasure. And we asked ourselves, why is that? And so that sparked some of these domestic adoption movements in these countries. In fact, I would say the countries that have some of the strongest domestic adoption movements now growing are the countries that were the biggest sending countries for intercountry adoption.
Wow.
Countries like Ethiopia, like Guatemala, like China, Ukraine. And so, even though these are, I would say, small budding movements that don't yet nearly meet the needs of all the orphans in the country, it's very encouraging, and we want to keep growing that.
It's almost like we should learn from that in our own
Yeah.
domestic adoption
And
scene.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And in many ways, that is happening. And many of the families who first became aware of the needs of kids
Sure.
for families through intercountry actually now are very involved locally through foster care in different ways.
Are there some countries that the United States should be pressuring though to open up to international adoption more?
I think it is really important that our State Department be sending a very strong message to all the countries that it interacts with that children belong in families, and kids need families to flourish. And just, whether it's allowing kids to grow up on the streets or in a large institution, that is not the ideal place for a child to grow. And so, we want to work with these countries and encourage them to first of all, create local systems, including local adoption, processes, and including the judicial process for that, where local adoption could grow. But as those countries become aware that all of those kids are not going to find homes locally, which almost certainly is the case, that's when they really do need to say, oh, some of these kids can find forever families on the other side of the ocean. And that's really good too, right? And so I think there's a kind of a progression of thought that we need to help countries walk through and even provide some of the guidance with helping them create the systems, including both the kind of child welfare systems and the judicial processes for kids to find permanency in permanent families, as opposed to kind of just informally languishing in systems or in orphanages or on the streets, and then growing up without really the identity and belonging and love that only a family can provide.
There, we saw this very clearly during the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, this bias against Christians adopting internationally, and maybe white Christians in particular, that there was some kind of colonization attitude, or do you see that being a big factor in international adoptions?
Yeah, there are some very loud voices that speak specifically about kind of the racial and ethnic element. And I mean, what you hear sometimes through this message is it would literally be better for a child to live or even die on the streets of the country where they were born rather than find a permanent family in another country whose skin color is different than theirs.
Right.
And to me, that's just so tragic.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there are even times when that kind of influence and voice is present in the U.S. foster system in a bias against cross-racial adoption or fostering of children of different races. I think overall, and our data confirm this, not from this particular study that you and I are talking about, but from other research, that most Americans have, I would just say, a sturdy common sense. That, hey, if a child can be adopted into, with a relative or into the community they're in, if that can happen, wonderful. But if they're going to grow up without a family, hey, far more important than skin color or culture or the language that you spoke when you were, 2 or 3 years old, is finding a safe, loving, permanent family.
And what would you say to people who are conservatives, particularly, who are nervous about getting involved in the child welfare system at all because of what we were just talking about, whether it be race, critical race theory kind of ideology, or the religious liberty issue we just talked about, being asked questions about a child's sexuality when the child is an infant, these things that really do happen. Is this another case of be afraid in as much as know what you're walking into, but be not afraid in as much as you can handle this?
Yeah, I think that's right, Catherine. I mean, it depends what part of the country you're in. If you're, much of the time, if you're in kind of a deep red state, you're probably going to find social workers and a system overall that is respectful of your faith and welcomes you in, and sometimes is desperately grateful that
Yeah.
people are stepping in. And you will sometimes find that even in the bluest states, right? Even people who are very progressive, but they're just like, thank God someone, or thank Zeus or whoever we thank them that
Right.
someone's stepping in for these kids, right? Then you will find people who really they sniff a religious person or conservative person, and they're like going to find some reason to be critical or maybe even try to exclude you. There's some court cases on
Right.
that right now from the Northwest, and so that's a very real thing. But I would just say, hey, if you sense that you feel some sense of calling to this, and you recognize that, man, there are kids who desperately need this, then I think you can be willing to face some hardships on their behalf, even if that's coming from a system that's biased against you because of, who you are, your faith, those sorts of things.
And it's another reason why having that support system from the get-go is so important. I
Absolutely.
know one young couple, a Hasidic couple, who yeah, they got the hardest time because they were adopting biracial children and they're Hasidic on top of it. So you're dealing with much different cultures, right? And they did get a lot of grief from people in the child welfare system, but they got just as much, if not more, support from
Mm.
their community, and that made all
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
difference. And so
Yeah.
not only did they adopt those twins, they adopted in a future emergency situation, and yeah, and the kids are flourishing, and the family is flourishing, and
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
so yeah, it's
what I want, what many social workers and professionals in this realm already know, but what I want the system to understand even more deeply is that, faith motivated individuals and families are their number one ally
mm,
if they are wanting to work for the good of kids, and especially those things that kids need that government cannot provide, right? Government can sometimes step in and provide certain protections for kids, and that's just as it should be, but the government cannot provide love.
Right.
Government cannot provide the long-term caring relationships that every human needs most to thrive. Government can't provide a place to go home to on the holidays, a person to call when you're trying to figure out what to do, on your first date, or all those things, right? Those are the things alone that individuals and caring families can provide. And so we desperately need individuals and families who are motivated by not just money or something else, but by the deep call of their faith to love and to welcome, and kids who have no biological, no genetic claim on them, right? And what this does take us back to the study that we're talking about today. What the data reveal is that it is deeply religious families and individuals who are by far the most likely to do that, in every realm. So, for instance, if you're comparing, I mean, people of any of the major faiths are more likely to step into foster care and adoption. And in particular, people of Christian faith are dramatically more likely. And so, like, if you're comparing against, a group of average, people who are atheist, agnostic, or no religion, what are sometimes called the religious nuns, and you just look at people who say, I'm a Christian, regardless of how serious, but just if they identify as Christian versus nuns, they are twice as likely to adopt, three times as likely to foster. They give significantly more money to child-related charities. 45% give versus 24% of religious nuns. When it comes to volunteering, virtually, actually every single form of engagement we looked at, they were much more likely. So they're, twice as likely to volunteer with a child welfare agency, more than twice as likely to get involved in supporting foster and adoptive families, more than twice as likely to mentor and support struggling biological families. So, remarkably, notably, the more religiously committed, the more devout a family or individual is, the more likely they're to do all of those things, right? The more seriously they take their faith, the more likely they're going to live it out in service to the vulnerable. And so, even if you are a agnostic social worker, you can see, hey, these are the folks that are most likely to step into these situations, including the hard things, to serve these kids, to serve families that need it.
Well, and you don't need a degree in theology in any denomination to get hit over the head with the word orphan in scripture and to have some sense. I mean, Joseph was a foster father of Jesus, I mean, adoption, and then there's the whole being adopted by God the Father, right? Adoption is all over scripture, and caring for the orphan is all over scripture. And so it's not shocking that someone who would even nominally take Christian faith seriously would have a sense that there might be a responsibility here.
That's right. That's right. And that commitment goes back, 2000 years. That even in the very early days of the Christian church, even when they were a very small kind of persecuted minority in the Roman Empire, the early Christians earned a reputation for going outside city walls and finding the babies that had been abandoned there. That was the kind of the Roman form of abortion called exposing, that if a child was born deformed or the wrong gender, they'd wanted a boy and it was a girl, or they just came at an inconvenient time. It was really acceptable in Roman pagan society to take the baby outside the city and abandon it there and expose it to the elements and wild animals. And Christians would go out and find these children and pick them up and wrap them and take them home, and then often, receive them into their own family, not just as household help, as was sometimes the case in pagan culture, but actually as sons and daughters, because of those deep scriptural and biblical and theological commitments that they had.
Is that why CAFO has orphan in the title?
Yes, I mean, that name was chosen before I came along, but I think it really, even though it is a controversial word at times, in the sense of, like,
And
of
almost
course,
seems a little archaic. Like, we
yeah,
don't
yeah, kind
talk
of
about
quaint in
orphans.
some ways. And and of course, if we were starting from scratch, I don't know what we would do today. But what we're really committed to is connecting the idea of serving the most vulnerable children with this deep biblical and historic commitment. This 2,000 years of history of Christians being distinctly known as caring especially for the kids that the world has forgotten or abandoned or ignored. That ties to this clear biblical command to care for orphans and widows in their distress. And so, while certainly there are a whole variety of other terms that fit well and in certain contexts are appropriate to use, that core, that fundamental burning core of the God of the Bible calls his people to care especially for the orphan, or for sometimes the word fatherless is used. That can't be forgotten, especially when you're inviting people of Christian faith into this work.
So speaking of CAFO, you have your annual conference coming up in the end of September, early October.
That's right, October 1 to 3 in Houston. And we would love anyone who, whether you're a veteran and you've been doing this for years, or you're first kind of considering being involved, we would love for you to join. It's a wonderful gathering. We'll probably have well over 2,000 people there, coming from usually 40, 50 different countries, so all over the world, as well as all over the US. And people who are motivated by their faith to serve vulnerable children and families in a whole host of ways, learning from each other, encouraging, one another on, sharing models and solutions to complex challenges, and really growing in this together.
And so, is it really for somebody who is not fully engaged yet? And I ask that knowing partially the answer. I know it's yes because I've been there. And it's part Christian music concert and part retreat and part information sessions. And obviously there's immersion stuff for the more advanced, but and different tracks. But it strikes me as if you're a couple that's kind of curious, maybe that empty nester couple, kind of curious, kind of feeling the nudge, not really sure how to get started, this is a great place to go to just get a sense, but you'll get something out of it even if you don't wind up fostering and adopting.
That's right. Yeah. And like you said, like maybe you think you're considering adopting, but you come and you realize, wow, there's a lot of young people who need mentors and training and business skills. And I have a small business. I could use my business and hire some of these young people with an eye for pouring into them, mentoring, encouraging them, right? There's, like we talked about earlier, right? There's so many different ways to use the gifts and skills we have and the unique assets we have to serve these kids, to serve their families. And the summit, we call it the CAFO Summit or the CAFO 2025 Summit, really, it includes that full spectrum. And you have, people who are 30-year veterans, learning from each other, sharing from their expertise. But you also have a lot of people who are very new to this. They're just trying to start a support ministry in their church, or they're just considering fostering or adopting. And we have, in addition to the main sessions where there is, music and singing and some really inspiring speakers and storytelling, there's also, well over 100 workshops that, range in everything from, how to start a church-based support ministry, considerations and getting involved in adoption, for parents who perhaps are raising kids who have come with a lot of pain and difficult backgrounds. How do you cultivate healing for those children within your home? That's a very, very important topic. And so, there's just, again, the full spectrum of these things.
And to be able to network and meet more people who are in the same boat as you too.
Yeah,
Whether
that's
it
right.
is as a newcomer or somebody who has been fostering for a while now, it's a great place to just for fellowship.
Yes, right. I am not alone, right? Sometimes you can feel very isolated with that. You're maybe the only one in your community that's doing that. And wow, suddenly you realize, oh, there's people all over who are passionate about this. And so you find your people, right?
And I would also encourage, and correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously it's a Christian conference and it's a Protestant conference primarily. That's the flair you'll get from it. But I know I'm actively encouraging some Catholics I know to go. And I would encourage people of other faiths to go to get ideas for how you can introduce this in your own communities. I think
Yeah.
that could be a use for the CAFO Summit as well.
Yes, yes. On the one hand, we're very just open about our deep commitments to Christ, and that the center point of this, that what impels us is the love of God revealed to us in Christ. and we're not shy about that. And it's part of the music, and it's part of the stories. But we also just love to have anyone who cares deeply about vulnerable children come and be a part of. We describe it sometimes as a giant gift exchange. The idea that
Yeah.
everyone comes with needs that need filling and gifts to share, and we want it to feel welcoming to anyone who wants to come and join us.
It is super inspiring. I didn't know what I was getting into the first time I went. And I was very naive though. I thought I could, do some kind of like overview of the whole thing. That's impossible. I was like exhausted trying to do that.
Yeah, yeah. Don't try to do it all, right? Just
Exactly.
find a few things and receive those.
Yeah, yeah. Whatever you get a taste of, I think it'll be beneficial to anybody. Was there anything about the study, Jed, that surprised you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, this leads to what I found most surprising and truly most encouraging. I mean, I love seeing that people of committed faith are stepping up in significantly higher percentages than the general population, and that's wonderful. But even better is when we began to look at foster and adoptive families and how they're doing. Because, like we talked about earlier, like it can be very tough. And, when you welcome a child who's known a lot of hurt and you're sharing in that hurt with them and you're walking through, sometimes it feels like you're walking through fires with these young people as they are struggling with themselves and with their past and different issues. And I have many dear friends who right this moment, I've got a list of a lot of names right here on my desk, people I pray for regularly who are in really tough stuff, with kids who they have welcomed and are loving. And so it's very difficult. Um, and yet, what's amazing is that as we asked families who had fostered and adopted, as well as families who hadn't, the degree to which they consider they're flourishing, like how would you score your well-being as a family? And we would ask kind of in five categories, the highest level being flourishing, and then four other categories down from there. It was remarkable to see the really large portion of fostering and adoptive families who report flourishing. It was actually much more than double the rate of the general population,
Mm.
which was really remarkable. And then at the other end of the spectrum, uh, we also saw that families that or fostering or have adopted were much, much less likely to report that they were in the lowest category of well-being.
Mm.
That they, were the term there was just struggling, but it was kind of like if you're in the worst possible state, check this box. And whereas religious nuns, so non-religious people who'd never fostered adopted, for them about 20% said I'm in this lowest category. For Christians who have fostered adopted, only 2% said that. So literally, it was 1/10 as likely to be in the lowest category of flourishing. And the remarkable thing is that, like we're talking about, that is not say that fostering or adoption is the pathway to smooth sailing. It's not, right? I mean, many of these families have been through the fires, many of them are in that, and yet even amidst that, they are saying, I'm flourishing, or the next category down, I'm doing pretty well. And what that says to me, Catherine, is a couple things that, first of all, I think people who choose to get into foster care adoption probably have a constellation of life commitments and practices that do lead to flourishing. They are people of a whole life faith. It's not just something kind of vaguely believe. Like they're living it, and so they have deep religious commitments and practices that are part of their life. Many of them spend, time in prayer each day. They're part of a church community that supports them. They gather regularly with other believers. They're very committed to marriage, even when it's hard. And so that constellation of things, I think, leads to flourishing, right? And
Mhm.
it's part of what even led them to foster care and adoption in the first place. I also believe that it's not just despite the hard things they face, but it's actually maybe even partially because of them that say they're flourishing today. And that's exactly what Scripture says. Like
Mm.
in Romans, Paul says, that we can rejoice in our trials because we know that trials produce perseverance, and perseverance produces hope, and hope does not dis and hope or it produces character. right? Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope doesn't disappoint us, right? That even going through the hardest things in life can have this wonderful way of deepening us, strengthening us, growing us in things that causes us in time to look at our lives and say, hey, this has been really hard. Maybe it even still is really hard, but I can also amidst that flourishing amidst things.
And such a reminder that, as you said, we're not looking for a life of no suffering. We're not looking for perfection either, in
Yeah.
ourselves and others, in situations. And once there's sort of that reality check of we're living in a fallen world, we're all fallen, but we have that eternal hope. It changes the situation entirely, and it's why, of course, we want to share, Christians want to share the gospel message, because it does lead to this happiness that the world can't give, right? As scripture says. I want
Yes,
to
yeah.
let
That
you.
scripture was right all along, right? When it says it is more blessed to give than to receive, blessed, fullness, happiness, joy, right? Not always easy. It's not it's not the good life, but it is the best life. And ultimately, as Jesus said, we only find ourselves, we only find life by giving it away. And that is what we see in this study, confirmed yet again.
And then we receive everything when we do live that path, all right? Um,
Yeah.
well, Jedd, I could talk to you for hours, but I need to let you go and be conscious of your time. Um, where where do you send people for more information? Obviously, CAFO's website, CAFO.org.
That's right. CAFO.org.
And for somebody who's watching this who can't make it to Houston for work or whatever reasons, but they really are, maybe as a couple, having an empty nest conversation. Maybe they're they got college kids who are juniors and seniors, maybe whatever the scenario is, where somebody's thinking, all right, maybe I'll take a look. And you mentioned, I know Naomi Riley, I would just listen to her give an interview from the American Enterprise Institute. She said, if you want to get a sense of the child welfare system and the contribution you can make in your area, be a court-appointed special advocate. Like CAFO, but CASA, not quite, different
Mhm.
letters in there. How do people do that?
Yeah, yeah. Most counties in the country have a CASA program. And so that would be, I think you could probably just Google CASA and your county, see if there's a program there. I imagine, also contacting the child welfare offices in your county would know as well. Some counties I think may have other types of mentoring programs also if they don't have a CASA program. But I agree, it's a great it is both a way to love a specific child, but it's also a great education because they take you through a whole lot of learning along that way. So, I would say for anyone who's feeling their heart stirred a little bit, whether they're considering adoption or not, first of all, I mean, don't let it go. Like, pray about this. Like, if nothing else, write a little post-it note and start praying about it for the next 30 days or something. And just say, God, if you want me to serve in this realm, please just draw me into it. And then when the time is right, if you feel like you want it, whether now or a little down the road, and take a first step to explore. And becoming a CASA, is a great way to learn, or contact, local foster agencies, especially if there's one that reflects your faith in your community. You can just say, hey, could I come down and learn about the needs? What are you looking for? Are you looking for foster parents? Are you looking for mentors? So those are two ways that you can really take those first steps.
And there are also lots of resources like Care Portal, many areas have, where you can, somebody's already figured out for you what families who are fostering or adopting need. That's another way. But the one thing I would encourage people is, whatever step your next step is, whether it's prayer or looking into CASA, or looking into fostering, Don't do it alone.
Mm.
Tell friends about it. Tell your church about it. Get other people involved. Let it be an education for other people too,
Mm.
and so that you never feel like even as a couple you're doing it alone.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Well, I again want to encourage people to take a look at CAFO's website and take a look at the summit. It might be exactly what you're looking for. And Jedd Medefind, thank you so much for all the work that you do, and thank you for making the time because you are very busy, and I appreciate it. And I know
Thank
our
you,
viewers
Catherine.
do
Well, I
too.
so appreciate how you are such a voice for this and so many other good things too. So, a real joy for me to be a little part of it with you.
Well, it's a blessing to have this platform in National Review and the National Review Institute. So thank you to everyone who supports us. Thanks.
Definitely.